Since 2018, I've done a video describing how we elect Congress and how that shapes what we can expect the results of the next congressional election to be. I recorded a 2022 video way back in April, and then while I was editing it, a few things happened. So I held off on finishing it. Well, now it's the middle of August and a lot has changed. But rather than redoing the whole thing, I'm going to go ahead and put out what I had in April, and then at the end of the video give a few updates. Maybe it'll be interesting to see what we knew in April and compare it to what we know now. So here's that video, and then stick around to the end for the update. It's 2022, and that means national elections in the United States. Here's what you need to know. Every 2 years, we elect 1/3 of the Senate and all 435 seats in the House of Representatives. The next presidential election isn't until 2024, so this is a midterm election. I've done videos on national elections in the United States since 2018, and my predictions have generally been pretty good because rather than getting swept up in particular issues and candidates, I just look at a few fundamentals. Which seats are being elected, and whether voters in those places have voted for Democrats or Republicans in recent elections. Election day is November 8th, 2022. Before then, we will have primary elections to decide who is running at all, but we don't even need to know who the candidates are to say how the election will go, because our democracy is depressingly predictable. Our use of winner-take-all elections guarantees that most states and most districts can be called before any votes are cast. And then there's the reality of midterm elections. Midterm elections almost always favor the party out of power. This year that means Republicans. The best predictor will be the president's approval rating, which I will be tracking on this chart. The last time a party in power did well in the midterms was 2002, when President Bush's approval rating was over 60%. So far this year, President Biden's approval rating has hovered around 42%. If it passes the 50% line, Democrats might do okay. If not, then we can expect this year to favor Republicans, potentially by quite a lot. As of right now, it's a safe bet that 2022 will be a big year for Republicans in Congress. But Drew, you say, we can't rely on patterns from prior decades, can we? Politics back then was boring and normal, and now it's surreal and unpredictable. Also, didn't Republicans literally physically attack the Capitol building last year? Wasn't an actual violent insurrection egged on by some of the same unrepentant people seeking re-election in 2022? Will the country really put Republicans back in power after Republicans seemed ready to topple our entire constitutional system and are, right now, opposing congressional investigation into the insurrection? And the reality is, yeah, they will. That's not because ordinary Republican voters want Trump-style authoritarianism. Some do, but most do not. But they'll vote for Republicans anyway, for a simple reason: the two-party system. Voters who oppose Democrats and their policies do not have anywhere else to go, and motivated reasoning is incredibly powerful. If you oppose Democrats, it is not that hard to convince yourself that the insurrection was not really an insurrection, or it wasn't really Republicans' fault, or it had nothing to do with the Republican running in your district, or whatever it takes to feel okay voting for Republicans again. Let's put a pin in that. First, let's see who's being elected this year and what a Republican-leaning year will mean practically. Let's start with the Senate. This year, 34 states will elect one of their Senate seats. Of those, 15 are presently held by Democrats and the other 19 by Republicans. That leaves 66 Senate seats not up for election. At first glance, it might look like Republicans have a bigger lift this year than Democrats, since they have to win more of the seats up this year to get a majority of 51. But that's deceptive. If we color in all the Senate seats up for election this year based on how reliably each state votes for one of the two parties, we can see that 8 of the Democrat-held seats are safe, while 16 of the Republican-held seats are safe. Democrats are playing defense in 6 states, while Republicans only need to defend 4. If we look at the seats up in 2024 and 2026, we can see that this is a pattern. About half of the 50 seats held by Democrats are in closely divided or Republican-leaning states, while only 5 of Republicans' 50 seats are in closely divided states, and none are in Democratic-leaning states. If you've gotten the sense that Senate Democrats are more divided than Senate Republicans, it's because to win a majority, Democrats have to convince Republican-leaning voters to vote for them. Republicans, on the other hand, can win a Senate majority without any Democratic votes. About half the country prefers Democrats to Republicans, but the system we use to elect the Senate privileges Republican voters, making their votes worth more, even without taking into account the nearly 1 million voters in the District of Columbia who do not even have a Senate contest to vote in. Right now, the Senate is tied. Each party has 50 seats. That gives the majority to Democrats because Vice President Harris gets to break any ties in Senate votes. But if Democrats lose even a single seat, Republicans will have the majority. And given the overall tilt in favor of Republicans, it's honestly hard to see when Democrats would win it back. At least not until that tilt evens out through some combination of states becoming bluer, or voters in D.C. and Puerto Rico gaining representation in the Senate, which is, of course, their Senate as much as any other Americans. Probably the most interesting states to watch this year for the Senate are Georgia, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. Georgia and Arizona both have newly elected Democrats defending their seats in states that lean Republican overall. Pennsylvania is an open seat, formerly held by a Republican, where it looks like Republicans will make the baffling choice to nominate celebrity quack doctor Mehmet Oz, who might not even live in Pennsylvania. This is all to say that in a Republican-leaning year, Republicans are strongly poised to win a majority in the Senate, but Senate races still sometimes come down to the strength of the candidates themselves, making it hard to confidently predict this year. Still, if I were putting money on it, I'd probably bet on a slim Republican majority in 2023. Also, if Dr. Oz becomes a U.S. Senator, I will tear my hair out. Come on, Pennsylvania. You're better than that. The House of Representatives is more complicated. All 435 seats are up for election, but before we can get into that, we need to talk about redistricting. Because of a law passed in 1967, every state has to elect its representatives from single winner districts. And because of a Supreme Court case from 1964, those districts all must have equal populations. So after the 2020 census, every state had to adopt a new district map to equalize the populations across the districts. As I mentioned in my 2020 video, the redistricting after the 2010 census was notoriously corrupt, with Republicans aggressively gerrymandering the states they controlled. That cemented a big Republican advantage into every congressional election over the decade. This year, the playing field will be relatively even because this time Democrats aggressively gerrymandered states like Illinois and New York, while Republican states were already about as gerrymandered as they could be. The biggest gain Republicans got this year was in Texas, which got 2 more seats after the 2020 census and where the new map ensured both of the new seats would go to Republicans. As of recording, a few states still do not have district maps at all. It's been a very contentious process. But if we assume that those remaining states will pass something like what they used in 2020, then the overall partisan landscape looks like this. There are 187 safe or lean blue districts and 204 safe or lean red districts, which is pretty close to even. Only 44 districts are swing districts. However, if you go by which party holds the seats now, you'll see that just like with the Senate, the Democratic incumbents are on much shakier ground than the Republican incumbents. Only 13 Republican incumbents are vulnerable, being in either swing or lean Democratic districts, with the rest in safe red districts. On the other hand, 30 Democratic incumbents are vulnerable, and Democrats only have a 3-seat majority right now if you take into account vacancies. So in 2022, Republicans will probably win a majority in the House. That, with the Senate, means that from 2023 to 2024, we can probably expect a Republican House and a Republican Senate with a Democratic president. In recent history, that kind of divided government has meant obstruction and gridlock, as well as a lot more governing by executive order. You might expect a swing back to Democrats in 2024, like what we saw in 2012. But even if there is a swing in popular sentiment, I do not expect the playing field in the House to remain level. That is because the Supreme Court, which is 2/3 Republican appointees, has signaled that it intends to change a thing or two about redistricting. There are basically only two checks on extreme gerrymandering: Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and state laws instituting independent commissions or state judicial review of district maps. As the redistricting cycle has proceeded, the Supreme Court has issued a few decisions that pretty strongly suggest it is going to dismantle both of those checks. For instance, the new district maps in Texas, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Alabama all pretty clearly violate the Voting Rights Act, but the Supreme Court halted attempts to block them in a case out of Alabama. The actual judicial opinions won't come out until next year, and when they do, they could disrupt a lot of the maps used this year. So I expect this horrible redistricting cycle to pick up again after the 2022 elections are over. I finished my 2020 video pointing out that every dollar and every minute spent trying to change districts, rather than convince voters, is proof of how diluted our votes have become. As we move into the next presidential election cycle, I am expecting more abuse of districts, a severely tilted playing field for the Senate, and then there's the presidential election. When Donald Trump lost in 2020, he tried to undo his loss in various ways, one of which was by pressuring election officials to pretend he had won because of vague, hand-wavy claims of fraud. That failed, but it morphed into attacks on professional election officials for their unwillingness to throw the election to Trump and an attempt to replace them with loyalists. It's hard to say what will come of that right now, but it's a step in the direction of what's called competitive authoritarianism, when elections, voting, and political parties are all part of politics, but become effectively irrelevant in the face of systems that make sure the outcome goes as expected no matter what the people want. Competitive authoritarianism and single-party rule are bad for Americans regardless of ideology, because they inevitably subordinate all legitimate principles to simple base corruption. We do not have to accept that. In the United States, the systems that privilege some voters over others, that force us into a zero-sum two-party system, and that reward corrupt practices like gerrymandering rather than campaigning and organizing, they are all downstream of the outdated winner-take-all rules that underlie our elections. The alternative, proportional representation, is getting more attention. Representative Don Beyer of Virginia has proposed a bill to adopt it for the House of Representatives, and at the local level, some cities are looking to adopt proportional voting for their city councils, which is both good for those cities and an important first step toward fairer elections nationwide. Most modern democracies use proportional representation, and while it doesn't solve all of their problems, it does ensure a level playing field with genuine competitive elections and more collaborative and effective governance.
Hello again. So, here are a few updates since April. First, I said in the video that the House playing field was relatively even. The thing that first made me pause on finishing this version was that the highest state court in New York struck down the Democratic gerrymander there. They have now instituted a map that is more fair for New York, but that then makes the overall national map less fair because it's one fewer Democratic gerrymander to counteract the advantage Republicans get from winner-take-all elections. This is one of the perverse things about our state-by-state redistricting. Gerrymandering is completely illegitimate power politics. Yet the single winner district system requires every state to gerrymander as much as they can, because if they don't, they're just unilaterally disarming. Now, we know that the maps overall will be more skewed in favor of Republicans than I had thought, but it's hard to say how meaningful that is, given that I still expect 2022 to be a Republican year anyway, meaning that Republicans will win a majority of the House under any foreseeable set of district maps. That brings me to the other big update. I recorded the video in April before the Supreme Court's abortion decision and before the horrific massacre at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. Abortion and guns are both issues where a majority of voters are closer to Democrats than to Republicans, and so some people have thought that events like these would cause blowback against Republicans, allowing Dems to keep the House. I remain skeptical. One reason the president's party does worse in the midterms is because the party is in power right now, so they get blamed when things are bad. You can't convince people that things will change by putting the party in power back into power, but more so That's probably why the clearest indicator of how they will do is the president's popularity. I would just show my updated Biden approval tracker, but it's useless because the y-axis didn't go below 40%, and Biden has been below 40% approval for the last month. His approval has bounced some in the last week or so, even going slightly above 40%, but even right now, it is still below Trump's approval from the same time in his presidency. Polls of whether voters prefer Democrats or Republicans in general have shown some improvement for Dems too, but also not enough for them to keep the House. It's still a safe bet that Republicans will have a majority in the House in 2023. The Senate is another story. The Pennsylvania Republican nominee is actually, incredibly, Dr. Oz, and polling shows him losing badly. Republicans have nominated terrible candidates in several other competitive states too, and polling shows most of them losing. Right now, 538 says Democrats have an over 60% chance of holding or expanding their Senate majority. I remain skeptical of that too. The 2022 Senate election will actually be an important test. One thing I've pointed out in these videos is that people generally vote party line and don't really care who the candidates are. That's why in the 2020 video, I predicted that Democrats would lose seats in the House, even though most polls showed them gaining seats. I was right about that, by the way. In the Senate, people do still care about candidates, but I would expect that to become less and less true as partisan polarization becomes more and more severe. If Republicans do win the Senate after all, that will be a sign that partisanship has come to dominate Senate elections as well as House elections. And if that's the case, it will be hard for Democrats to take back the Senate for a very long time. Even if you prefer Republicans to Democrats, that is bad. One-party rule does not end well for anyone. If we want the U.S. to be a free and prosperous place to live, we need a more representative government. Fortunately, there are signs of progress there. In the April script, I mentioned momentum for proportional representation at the local level. The most promising place for that is Portland, Oregon. This November, Portland voters will have the opportunity to vote for a ballot measure expanding their city council and electing it from multi-winner districts with a proportional form of ranked choice voting. If it passes, Portland will be by far the largest city that elects its council proportionally. If we're ever going to break out of the miserable two-party winner-take-all system we use now, we need more of this. I'll link to the coalition promoting the Portland measure in the description. Check them out and consider looking up local groups interested in the same sort of thing where you live.